And in a sense, we're looking in little corners and places that nobody has ever looked before. And that's a lot of fun.
Hi, hello, and welcome to Coffee Literature Review. I'm Chris Hendon, and I'm joined by Doran Pennington. Today we're going to be discussing a paper published in the journal Precision Agriculture. The article was published in 2021, and it's titled An Unmanned Aerial Vehicle to Evaluate Frost Damage in Coffee Plants. Coffee plants don't like it when it gets too cold. So obviously then coffee frost can lead to coffee plants producing less coffee, perhaps even dying. And so being able to monitor whether your crop is frosting is important for crop sustainability and also being able to make good decisions. Joining me today to talk about this article is Camila Khalifé.
No, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Now, Camila, we met at the Roast Summit in Portland earlier this year. But of course, I've been aware of your work for quite some time because when I first entered into coffee, you actually were also first entering into coffee in 2014. You've been working in coffee for a decade now. You've founded Botánica, which is a quality lab in Ecuador. Are you still affiliated with them?
Yes. So we started Botánica as a coffee shop. When I started in coffee, I was like, like everyone, naive, thinking a coffee shop was the best idea ever.
Yeah. Is it not? Because I'm thinking about it.
Shocking. No, it's not. At least not in a market like mine. Quito is a small city. So yeah, soon I realized that I enjoyed more the education and quality side of coffee. So I started like slowly moving from coffee shop to lab/training center. And now we closed the coffee shop. And we are an independent lab because, as you know, many times producers the only way they can get feedback on their coffee is from buyers or from someone who has any interest in their coffee.
Yeah.
So it's not, could be fair, but you don't know. So our idea is to be that third party or someone who can provide feedback with no interest or conflict of interest. Yeah.
But you're also uniquely qualified to give feedback on high quality coffee because you're also a World Barista Championship sensory judge, right?
Yes. So I started judging championships in 2015. So yeah, my sensory education has come from the CQI as a Q grader, cupper, etc., and also like evaluating actual drinks.
I'm assuming tasting coffee is easy for you. So what was the most difficult part of becoming an international judge?
It's easy, but I realized by doing that like a part of doing it is like your sensory abilities, but a large part is your communication abilities. So I think that's the biggest challenge for not native English speakers, to learn how to accurately describe what you're perceiving. So it's like, it's in your head, but then how you communicate it to the other judges, to baristas, it's a challenge, yeah.
So I met a guy who runs a roastery in Morocco, and he was saying that in training people there, it's very difficult to convey or to translate words from English to Arabic that describe things like mouthfeel, but that what Arabic speakers do have a lot of words to describe are weights. And so whenever he was trying to train people in Morocco, he realized that in order to convey those ideas, he had to kind of translate them first into something that is then able to be taught to other people. So it's an interesting case where language really has an impact on how you're communicating.
It is interesting. Yeah, I was leading a judges panel for a championship in Egypt last year, and for me it was curious that all the baristas described the coffees in English. So it was like the presentation was in Arabic, and then they would describe in English, which we were talking how Arabic or Spanish are richer languages to describe things, yet we are like pushed to learn and describe in English.
imagine a Brewers Cup or a Barista Championship where it was all in English, but then someone transitioned to describing the coffee in Arabic. Or that'd be really impressive, actually.
You are going to need it. Yeah, exactly.
Well, okay. So let me go back one step here. So perhaps we met before, but we really got to spend some time together at the Roast Summit in Portland, Oregon earlier this year. And I had the extremely challenging job of having to give a seminar after you. After you've just gone up there and taught everybody all this interesting stuff, I guess they put me in there to make sure that people were going to fall asleep that evening. So, and at that seminar, what you did was you were talking about defects in coffee, challenging this notion that the current SCA limits on the types of defect, the concentration and types of defects that exist in coffee may be perhaps ill-advised or ill-defined for some types of defects, because not all of them really are as negative on the cup as perhaps we're taught.
Yes. And just to be clear, we are talking about green coffee defects, like physical defects.
That's right.
Right? Because there are also the others, phenol, mold, the ones you can perceive in the cup. So, yeah, what I noticed is that they are not necessarily correlated, So when you see these beans that look weird, like darker or smaller or weirdly shaped or whatever, all the defects that are included in the green grading standards, they don't necessarily have an impact on the cup. Or I should say, we don't know. I don't think there's enough research to say, okay, this is the actual effect of this particular defect. And for not knowing, I feel the standards are a bit too strict,
Well, the easiest way you can show someone that is to do what you did, and the following day do a sensory activity, I would say, because you weren't collecting data, were you, on that day?
No, it was more, activity.
Yeah, it was an activity where you brewed up some coffee that had these different types of defects in them, and we just assessed whether people were repulsed by them or could tolerate them or whatever. And I can tell you that there was only one that I felt was really negative, and all the other ones were totally passable. Do you remember what the really negative one was?
100% defects. You know why I put that sample? Because when roasters want coffee free of defects, those defects stay somewhere at their origin, and they are not garbage. People use them, and people roast them, and people drink them. So when you remove defects to have perfectly looking coffee, and then you have all the defects all together and you roast them, that's the result. But if you have, as in the others, we had 10%, 15, 18% in one of them, the impact was not so big. How far can you push it until you start noticing? And I am sure that varies defect to defect and origin to origin, and depends, I don't know, on the variety, process, etc. So yeah, my point is, like, when you have all together, and that's what we drink at origin. So yeah, it doesn't seem fair.
No. Well, number one, it's not fair. Number two, the point that you made that resonated with me and will continue to be something I talk to my students about is that if you're sorting out 10% of the beans, you are immediately creating 10% waste. I can tell you that at 100% of it, perhaps it is negatively tasting, but at 10% or below, and in fact, the listeners of this podcast should tune into episode 2, where we talk about the Quaker defect. You can actually tolerate a tremendous amount of that. So all this is to say is that the work that you've done has had a profound impact on the way that I think about coffee and the way I think about quality of coffee, certainly in our laboratory, but also in how I talk about it.
And just one more thing to add is that coffee, like all the coffee that is produced on a farm, the cost of production is the same. So
Right.
It's not that those defects, that 10% or whatever the percent of defects you are sorting out, has a lower cost of production. So the cost of production is the same. So you are basically not allowing those beans to be sold for a better price.
Yeah, so then I think the conclusion there is that we really do need to spend some time trying to scientifically understand the impact of such defective beans, because if we could make a statement that we could tolerate, a certain concentration of some chemical or some bean, whatever resolution we end up at, that has a tremendous value upside to not only the producer, but also the cafe, to everybody along the supply chain.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Let me turn then to the paper that I sent you to read. Now, as I try to do on this podcast, I try to get an expert in who has maybe some interest or some specialty in the domain. And in this case, you have multiple interests and sort of expertise in this domain, because this is about producing regions, and it's about challenges that farmers and producers will face when trying to cultivate high quality crops, but also try and take the expert and push them just a little bit outside of their comfort zone to see where we end up. Let us quickly first discuss frost. Frost is not a defect of the green bean. Frosting is this idea that, this observation that in some places it gets cold. And overnight it can get cold enough that you'll see frost develop on coffee leaves, and the leaves then seemingly will undergo a chemical process where it's thought that acids and other enzymes are released within the leaves and inevitably result in the chlorophyll of the leaf being decomposed. And so as a result, the coffee can no longer catch light, basically convert CO2 to make sugar and produce oxygen. In other words, the leaf is dead. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing so, if you have a frosted coffee, if you have a plant that is undergoing this frosting, so it gets cold overnight, I guess then what happens is that the plant is no longer able to produce as much fruit, lower quality fruit. The plant may even inevitably die. Camila, did I get it right? Is that frosting?
Yes. And here in Ecuador, I would say that affects not only coffee, but all other crops. And depending on where you are located, it happens at a different altitude. And so there are places where it's more common for frost to affect coffee crops. Here in Ecuador, I don't think that's the case.
Yeah.
Can definitely happen. But closer to the Ecuador, you would need higher altitudes than where coffee grows.
Yeah, right. Because it's got to get colder overnight, right? So it's
exactly. So basically, it's when temperature reaches 0 degrees Celsius or lower.
Yeah. So to that point, then, this is not a concern for every coffee producing region. Most people, when they think of threats to coffee crops, are usually these days talking about the fact that Earth is warming up and that Arabica is under threat because you're going to push the upper limit of average temperature. This is actually the opposite of that. This is that we're going to push the lower limit, in the sense that overnight in a certain winter time, you might find that there's some condensation that then deposits on the leaves, and then as a result can harm or even completely wipe out an entire crop. Doran, tell me about it.
Which is not at odds with climate change, because something that has been observed is that weather is becoming more erratic and temperature swings are becoming greater. And it doesn't have to be that in the day it's snowing outside for you to get frost. It just has to be that at some point in the night, the specific conditions combine to create frost on the leaves.
I was going to say that it's not necessarily that global warming is going to reduce the chances of frost or something like that.
Right.
But what is interesting is that these species like Arabica or specific varieties that are susceptible to temperature, they are susceptible to both super high and super low.
Is it easy to check every single plant on a coffee farm for the emergence of a defect? Or frost, I should say, or defects, whatever.
No, I think in general, no one checks every plant for anything. So you always take samples or map the farm, and there are methods to have samples of the whole farm, even if there's a pest or frost or whatever damage, you won't see tree by tree, right? The study that we are talking about was carried out in Brazil, right? So it's very common in Brazil to see huge farms, like large, very large plots of land.
So to this end, then we've at least unpacked the latter half of the title of this paper, which is that we're evaluating frost. Now let me tell you how we're going to do it. Okay, so this idea of an unmanned aerial vehicle, that does make this sound more exotic, more like it was funded by the U.S. Air Force than it needs to be. An unmanned aerial vehicle is simply known as a drone, and this could be one of those four propeller things that you get at a conventional box store. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. Doran, tell me about flying a drone over a coffee farm.
So they have found a plot of land on this probably giant coffee farm, which is uniquely susceptible to frost because it has an area that's on a slope. And they mentioned in this paper that frost usually affects areas that are kind of at low points because the cool air is dense and will sink into those zones, and then it's hard for it to rise out. So that's often where you see frost. So they've picked a zone on this farm that they know to be susceptible to frost, and they've flown a drone that's outfitted with a multispectral camera. So this camera is able to image different wavelengths of light and take pictures as it flies over the farm. And they've split the plot that they're measuring into 3 zones, which are categorized as high, medium, and low risk based on their elevation. And then there are also samples within each of those plots where they're going to take physical measurements of the chlorophyll content of the leaves, inspect the plants for damage, and they're going to see that if they can map the drone measurements, which are, very easy to do, you just program a path for the drone to take, you tell it to take pictures, and then you have some image processing software to run. If they can actually map that data onto the intensive measurements of going and checking each individual plant, checking the low, middle, and high regions of each plant for damage and chlorophyll content, to make it easier for the farmers to understand where frost damage is occurring.
Leaves are green. And if you want to measure how green something is, there are 2 ways you can do it. One way is you can shine a green light at it and you can determine how much of it is absorbed. The other way is to shine all the other wavelengths of light at it and measure how much is reflected. And given that frost damaging results in a decline in the amount of chlorophyll, which is the compound that gives rise to the color green, what we're really trying to do is we're going to use different wavelengths of light, and we're going to measure the light hitting the camera lens at different wavelengths and detect how green it is.
So basically what they were measuring, like in human terms, is damage, right? So how, like, I don't know the exact components, but they were measuring the percentage of damage in each section of the plant. They also started with the theory that the higher zone of the plant, or because they also categorized the canopy. So it was like, if they can measure what's happening in the higher zones, you can determine what percentage of damage the other zones would have, right?
Yeah. So to restate that, just to make sure I'm on the same page as you, you can think of the coffee plant as a tree, and the upper part of the tree is one zone, the middle part of the tree getting closer to the ground is another zone, and then there's yet another zone, which is the leaves that are much closer to the ground.
So they have 3 different bands of light that they're looking at, which go from green to kind of red to a little bit more red to beyond red.
Yeah, so 4 bands, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
4 bands, yes.
And so you can think of these as the amount that's reflected. So one way to think about this is that if the leaf starts to die, it's going to start to go brown, and so a little bit less of the red light will be reflected because now the leaf will be absorbing red. And so in this sense, then there are lots of different ways that you can take these 4 different wavelengths or 4 different bands of light, and you can then start to calculate something. And I guess obviously then if you're trying to make a measurement from above, it would be useful if you could say something about the entire plant by just looking at the leaves that are on the top of the plant.
Exactly. So what they noticed is that effectively the leaves that were in the higher part were the ones with the higher percentage of damage. And they did this in the 3 different zones that Doran was mentioning because they were like a high climate risk in the lower parts of the plot. So they measured how it impacted it, like the damage was in each of these altitudes, right?
Yeah, and the metric that they end up using is called the normalized difference vegetation index, which is a ratio of the amount of NIR light, and so near infrared and red light. And by measuring those 2 things, you get a number which is correlated to the healthiness of the vegetation, where an NDVI, a normalized difference vegetation index of 0, means there's nothing growing there. There's nothing green. And a value of 1 is healthy land or healthy vegetation. And so they have a plot where they're actually showing you what the NDVI is for different areas of this farm. And you can see that in the high risk area where they measure a lot of frost damage, the value is approaching 0. So that means that there's a lot of damage to those plants. They're turning very brown.
That was, well, so the NDVI is one way that worked pretty well. And there were a couple of other ways that also worked pretty well. I think the so-called MSR, the modified simple ratio, which is maybe named as a joke because of all the ways that you could make a simple ratio. This one has this one is the least simple of the bunch. But yet again, this one includes the fraction of light from near IR and red. So it does not include, the point we're trying to make is it is not a measurement of green light, and it is not a measurement of the so-called red edge band, which is somewhere between red and near IR. Let us summarize then. What is working well here is if you measure the amount of red light that is being absorbed by the plant, that is usually a good indication of how green your plants are. They also seemingly say that there are a couple of other methods that look pretty good and may work well. But then I have to trust them for the ones that they say that don't work well, right? Now let's unpack just one of them. Let's go for what do you want to do? SAVI. That's an easy one, right? So that's the soil adjusted difference vegetation index. This one has the near IR, the red yet again, but the key difference here is it's adjusting for the color of the soil. Why would this not work in a coffee farm, Camila? What do you think?
I guess I think it doesn't work in drones generally because you like the foliage is covering the soil, so you cannot see, like you cannot take images of what's happening beneath, right?
Exactly. You can't see the dirt.
Yeah, something that's cool about this paper is they actually tell you the speed of the drone. So they tell you that this drone is flying at 3 meters per second. And if you do the math, that comes out to 10 kilometers in an hour. So if you have a massive coffee farm, it's not a stretch to say that, you know, on a day where the night before you know that it was really good, it got quite cold, this could just be something that you deploy every now and then whenever you think the conditions call for it and have it map more or less your entire farm, or just confine it to the high risk areas that you know of because of the topology of your specific plots.
I think it's application in large volumes, like large plots of land and for large volumes of coffee, which is what we need, I guess, to keep the world moving. It's very interesting, and it's like it's not hard to apply, but I don't know how it applies to like smallholders that are all over.
With this knowledge of the fact you can fly a drone over a coffee farm to detect whether it's frosting or not, what can we do with this information?
Decisions. Basically, like if producers have this information, they can make decisions because now they know. It's like they can make short, mid-term decisions as well as long-term, right? So in the shorter terms,
yeah, like don't plant your plants in that place.
yes, and I can talk more about that. Or choose a different variety. Like in the longer term, choose different varieties that are less temperature susceptible. In the shorter, like you can apply fertilizers and like things to the soil that will sort of I don't know the word in English, contrarrestar.
So thinking about that, whenever you see a scientific article published that says we're going to help the producer in some way with this new science thing, but it's going to cost a ton of money to get involved in it. That's usually not very thoughtful, because it's like not every producer wants to invest in some new expensive thing that may only be an incremental advance and maybe doesn't even have a short-term improvement for them. However, this paper goes one step further than having this fancy camera that they strapped onto a drone. They also make the case that it's possible that you might be able to get away with just a standard RGB, in other words, a phone camera, just a standard camera. And the reason they say that is because if what you're doing is detecting red light, well, R in RGB is red light. And so in principle, you could just use a phone camera and then do some sort of image processing to sort of, I guess you'd probably use AI or something, but you'd be able to back out whether frosting was occurring with relatively low entry-level technology. These days, drones are cheap. I mean, one that you program to fly is a little more expensive, but drones are cheap, like $100 or something. And for a little camera attached to it, also cheap. And so in principle, this is actually pretty interesting, right? Because it's like, it's not that much of an investment to get a good piece of information that may tell you about whether there's parts of your farm or producing area that are susceptible to frost damage. And that's something that's maybe worth knowing.
In Brazil, you have like large farms. In other countries like mine, producers are like smallholder farmers. They have half a hectare, 1 hectare, 3 hectares. So it's like they have it where they have it. And if it doesn't work, like the decision of, okay, I'm going to plant somewhere else, it's not so realistic because that's what they have to work with. So I think it's very interesting when you have like the space to make these decisions, the physical space, and like the knowledge and the training to use technology for making these decisions. Like many producers struggle with technology, even for communication, like text, WhatsApp, like all these, because it's not necessarily something big in rural areas in coffee growing communities.
The coffee farm that's studied in this paper is 1 hour drive away from the university where the researchers are. So this is something that is really hitting close to home. And I think it's really great for the scientists in this paper to be able to make an advance that directly affects the health of their community, right? If they can help this coffee farm be more productive, that has a lot of downstream effects for people that live in the area. So I actually pulled up this farm on Google Maps. They tell you the name of it and where it is and its precise coordinates. And you can look up the satellite view of the plot, and it's really easy to find the specific plot that they show in the paper. And you can see in the high-risk area that's closest to that road, there are splotches of brown. So you can, I'm not 100% sure that that's frost damage, but you can tell with your eye that there are areas in that specific place where there are a little more brown leaves than in the healthier zones.
I actually try to look more and more for research and papers and like investigation in general done in producing regions, because it's not weird to find a lot of papers and a lot of research on all things coffee that are so disconnected from what happens at origin.
A lot of producing regions don't have the scientific resources. And I'm sat here in Eugene, Oregon with a fully equipped lab, and I'm far away from these producing regions. And it just points to this idea. I probably need to do a better job. That can be my goal for the next year of research. All right, Camila, that's it. That's all we've got for you today. Thank you for making time for us.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I really enjoyed reading it and discussing it with you.